Pruning is really quite simple. It really requires good common sense, and that's all you have to keep in mind. There are a few basics, however, you should follow when it comes to pruning. Let's discuss those. For example, if we have a tree, I'm not a very good drawer, but that gives you an idea of what we're trying to accomplish. The main thing that we want to do in pruning is to get good air circulation and sunlight exposure into the center of the tree. You'll notice whenever you prune that along the branches that you prune, there are buds. Those are growth buds. And whenever we prune above an inside bud, we force growth inward, which is exactly what we do not want to accomplish. Instead, we want to prune above an outside bud to force the growth outward. This then opens up the tree and does allow for better air circulation and sunlight exposure. It's that simple. So again, that's just good basic common sense. Now, possibly if we were pruning an evergreen or something and we wanted it to be bushier, we might prune above an inside bud. But when it comes to fruit, flowering, and shade trees, we want to get that good air circulation and sunlight exposure, so it's always the pruning cut is made just above an outside bud. Now, don't make the mistake that so many people make, and that is to just come out and whack off the top of the tree. It's grown too tall, and to eliminate that problem, it's just whacked off. And that is the worst thing you can possibly do, because the minute that you do that, and you probably have noticed this under telephone lines or in other situations where a tree has been pruned back very severely, that you get long sucker growth. And that sucker growth then, of course, totally ruins the shape of the tree. So you don't want to do that. One other thing you don't want to do, you'll notice this tree shape here is kind of, it's an oval shape. Now, oftentimes people decide, I don't want an oval tree there. Instead, I want a spreading tree. Well, Mother Nature didn't intend that tree to grow in a spreading manner. She intended to grow in an oval shape, and no amount of pruning is going to make it spread. So if you want a spreading tree in the place where you have an oval or an upright tree, there's one solution, and that is to yank the tree out completely and put in a spreading type tree. So it's just really the removal then of a tree that's ugly in its location. That's the only way you get around it. Mother Nature has an intended growth for each tree, and what you're doing in pruning it is to enhance the overall beauty of that tree. Now, I mentioned these sucker growths. If you have a branch that has sucker growth coming from that growth, it's very important that you properly prune and remove that sucker growth. And what we usually do is to rest the pruning shears on this branch and make a cut. And as you can see what's happened there, we've left a little stub. Now, from that stub, you're going to get probably 4 or 5 more sucker growths. And it's just going to intensify over the years until pretty soon you have a little knob about the size of your fist with 50 sucker growths appearing from it. So when you remove that, be sure you remove it flush with the branch. It's exceptionally important. Now, down here at the bottom also, sometimes we get, right here at the root level, we get suckers growth. When that develops, again, we go in with the pruning shears and prune that off, and always leave a little stub. So instead of one, first thing we know, we've got a dozen or 2 dozen or 4 dozen or more. So instead, if you'll just go in with that first growth and either follow it all the way back to the point where it originates and remove it flush with the root where it comes from, or grab it by your hand and snap it off. That way it will snap off at the point that it originates and you've eliminated the problem. If the growth is at a wrong stage of growth, when you snap it, you're going to get a whole bunch of leaves in your hand because it has to be brittle enough to actually snap away from the point at which it originates. But those are the basics. Just keep that in mind. Always prune to enhance the beauty of the shape of the tree. Use good common sense when you prune. And as a rule, on fruit, flowering, and shade trees, prune above an outside bud. That's what's most important. Now, let's take a look at the type of pruning equipment that you need. For the pruning of trees, probably the handiest thing is a pole pruner, because you can reach way up in the tree to prune. In fact, this will allow you to prune somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 feet up into a tree. And I know this is a tool that maybe a lot of homeowners wouldn't have, but it's one usually you can rent, or sometimes your neighbor would even have one. Then this is one you should have. This is what we call a lopping shears. And this will take any branches your thumb-sized or even larger and do a good job of removing them. It's a good sturdy type of pruners that you'd really need for any kind of pruning at all. Of course, on the larger branches, you need a pruning saw. That's a very important implement. And for almost all of the pruning that you do, you can get by with a step ladder and a little hand pair of pruning shears. So this is one you should have even for your house plants and other plants around a yard. It's the most important of all the tools. Usually these others you can borrow from neighbors if you're a good person to take care of the tools for them. Now let's go out and actually do some pruning. The best time for pruning deciduous trees. Now, deciduous means a tree that loses its leaves during its dormant season. Now, this is winter time, of course, and this apple tree is barren of leaves. The best time to prune them is during the winter dormant season. And usually when you're pruning a tree like this, it's best if you have two people. Now, there should be one person out away advising what to prune, while I'm up in the tree actually pruning the branches that they advise pruning. And I always suggest that that never be a husband and wife. Enlist the services of a neighbor instead. There'll be less trouble. Let's do a little bit of pruning. Now this, as you can see, is an inside branch, so I'll quickly remove it. By the way, as you go through pruning, every now and then you'll see where you made a mistake the year before. Don't let that bother you. For example, here I made a mistake. This branch comes right up through the center of the tree. So I'll just go in here and totally remove the branch because that's cutting out too much air circulation and too much sunlight exposure right into the center of the tree. And we correct our mistakes, really, each year as we prune. And don't be afraid to make mistakes because everybody makes mistakes in pruning trees. Now here's a branch also that carries totally right into the center of the tree. That is removed, and you notice I remove it flush with the branch. Here's another one that's coming right into the center of the tree. We'll go back and remove it at the point at which it originated. Another one coming into the center of the tree. Off it comes. The one below it. And on we go. That's basically what we want to get out. We want to open up the tree and allow for a lot better air circulation. Oops, that wasn't a very good one. And sunlight exposure. Here's another one. Now, keep in mind, every now and then you'll come along little branches like this. Don't remove those. Those could be fruit spurs. That's where your fruit could appear on your branches. Now, you see what I'm doing? I'm opening up this tree. The branches are spreading out, and that's where the fruit's going to form. That's what we really want to accomplish. Also, you'll notice that some of this growth is getting a little bit long. So again, what we'll do, as I mentioned earlier, is to prune to an outside bud to force the growth outward. Okay, towards me is an outside bud here. So by cutting just above that, this is how the new growth is going to form from that point. And you'll notice that I cut a long branch. See, this branch reaches from clear up here to clear down here. That's last year's growth. If I had instead just taken the tip growth and made it just a little cut like most people do because they're afraid to prune, a whole bunch of little tiny twigs are going to develop from that growth, and they cannot support an apple. It'll break off. The weight of the apple would be too much. But by cutting it back severely, like I have cut it back, we'll get new, good, strong growth from this branch, and it can support an apple or a pear or a plum or whatever the fruit might be. So keep that in mind. Do severe pruning when you prune. Don't do that little tip pruning because that's doing more harm than good. Now let me also go back. Here's another one. Here's a good branch that's standing right up in the middle of the tree. We'll remove that. Here's one that's growing into the center of the tree. We'll remove that. In fact, I'm going to cut again above an outside bud to force that growth outward. Here's another one coming up. And that's just basically what we're trying to do with any kind of a fruit, flowering, or shade tree, is to open up the center of the tree and get all this tangled growth. Any dead, decayed, weak, or broken branches are the first ones to come out, and then any of these that intertwine are the next ones to come out. And really, pruning is just that simple. It's just the use of good common sense. And remember, in the bigger trees, two people, one out away advising, one in the tree like me pruning. Okay, let's move on to grapes next and take a look at how to prune them during the dormant season. what do you do when you get into a big mess like this? This grape arbor is just totally overgrown, and if it's not pruned back, next year's growth is going to be another 6 or 8 feet, and it's going to be just totally out of hand. So the important thing for you to do is just really to get started is to go in here and do some whacking. And maybe that's not the best pruning suggestion, but nevertheless, that's about all you can do until you get back in here to something that makes some sense. And grapes, in order to produce well, they do need to be severely cut back. So you might keep that in mind. Just go in and whack away, and don't pay too much attention to where you're whacking until you get some of this tangled growth just out of the way so that the vines look halfway decent. Then once we get down, they tangle up, as you know. Vines, like the grapes, really intertangle a lot, so we'll just have to get some of that growth out of there to begin with. No other way to do it. Now, you'll notice on this one here, this growth originates from a main cane, and in pruning grapes, that's what's really most important, is to first of all find your main canes and then do your pruning from the main cane. In this particular case, since this is the main cane, we come above the second bud and we make the cut. So I cut that back so first of all I could work in there. On this one we'll do the same. Actually, I've already done it, just quite by accident. There's one bud and here's the second bud. Let's go back to this one. It's originating from the main cane, and I don't know if you can see this, but we'll go back and prune above the second bud. This one originates from the main cane, so we'll go back and cut above the second bud. But for the rest of the growth, just go in and prune it out and get all this back so that it looks like something halfway decent. And you're just going to have to spend a little bit of time pruning away to eliminate the mess so that you can get down and do the very fine pruning, first of all. Now, I've kind of pruned that out of the center to give you an idea. I'll do the entire arbor that same way so that you have it totally within bounds. Then the new growth that starts next year is going to be another 5 or 6 feet. And you may have to do some pruning on that during the growing season. But do be careful because the grapes do appear on the new growth. If you do too much pruning, you'll remove some of your grapes. Okay, first let's talk a little bit about how do you take the top out of a tree. As you've noticed probably here in my garden, there are lots of tall trees. Most of all of them have been topped. But there's a proper way to top a tree and an improper way. And usually is what happens in topping a tree is that a person stands on the branches and then at about a convenient height of 3 feet or so, they top the tree. Well, that's not the way to do it because decay is apt to set in, and first thing you know, that could take the whole tree. And the other thing that's incorrect here is you never make a cut flat. The reason being is that, of course, water will accumulate there and disease then will set in. So it's exceptionally important when you do make a cut that you make it at a slight angle so that any moisture then rolls off of the cut and down off the tree so that there's no chance of decay setting in. But the proper way to cut, first of all, is just above the branches. So the cut would be made instead about like so, at the angle again, and just above the branches. Now, why do we do that? So that decay does not set in and eventually wipe out the top of the tree totally, but also these branches then conceal the cut. So it's not nearly as obvious that the top of the tree has been taken away. Always keep that in mind. And these top branches also, way out towards the end, should be topped back a little bit too, and the next set of branches, if you can reach them, should also be topped back a little so that you get a better shape to the top of the tree. I'm speaking primarily in this particular case of evergreen trees like firs and spruce and cedars and trees of that nature. However, this same basic principle does apply to deciduous trees, fruit trees, flowering trees, and shade trees as well, right above the branches, proper place to cut them. Usually in a wet climate, I would also suggest that cut be treated with a pruning healing compound. That's quite advisable so that decay again does not set in. What about a big branch like this? How do we handle it? Let's say this branch has to be removed, and we'll handle it, say, before we top the tree. So there's a branch above. So what we'll do is take a rope, lasso around that, come down and attach it to this branch as well. Then is what we do is we take our saw and about a foot or two from the main trunk of the tree, we make a cut up in from the bottom. Then we'll go out here and we'll make a cut from the top. Now, you've severed this branch completely, but it's being held in place by your rope, the tying of the two branches together. This upper one is supporting this one. So then you can lower that very easily to the ground below. Now, you have this stub still, and you want to come in and, of course, remove this next to the trunk of the tree. You don't want any stub left at all. So again, make your cut up from the bottom right at the trunk of the tree and make your next cut from the top. See, if you do that the opposite way is what happens. If you make a cut, for example, from the top first, then the weight of that branch, unless it's supported the way it is, or even here on this little stub, will tend to tear away. And the first thing you know, you're going to tear away that bark and probably part of the bark along the trunk of the tree. And you're going to actually do a lot of damage to the tree. So always make your first cut from the bottom, the second cut from the top, in the removal of any large branches of tree. Now, for this kind of cutting, of course, you'd want to use a saw, a pruning saw. But you may, if the branch is really large, you may want to use instead a chainsaw to do an effective job of removing the branch. Now, those are the basics in topping a tree or removing large limbs from a tree. Undoubtedly, the most popular plant in the garden worldwide is the rose. The beautiful flowers of roses are just unbeatable. They're easy to prune if you understand a few of the basics of roses. First of all, by proper pruning, or severe pruning, let's say, you can create long stems and large flowers. By tip pinching, or just very light pruning, you get short stems and small flowers. So keep that in mind. If you want the long stems and the beautiful large flowers on the hybrid teas, now those include varieties like Peace, the world's #1 rose. Also, Tropicana, Charlotte Armstrong, and many of the other large flowering varieties do the severe pruning. And to give you a simple rule of thumb, any pen or pencil. Now, any cane that's the size of this pen, say, or a pencil, should be pruned 4 to 6 inches from the ground. Any cane that's about the size of your little finger should be pruned about 4 to 8 inches from the ground. Any cane the size of your forefinger, somewhere between 8 and 12 inches from the ground, and thumb-sized and larger, try to keep them under about 18 inches in height. Keep the rose bush down, and occasionally discard some of the really old canes so that you create new growth and consequently better flowering of your plant. Now, the other important thing is that just what we've been talking about pruning. You want good air circulation and sunlight exposure into the center of the plant. That is a key. That's necessary to really have good flowers on roses. So, first thing we do in pruning is to eliminate the center canes. Now, this one here, for example, is coming right up through the center of the cane, or of the plant. So we'll remove it completely. You'll notice also that the branches are crisscrossing here. So let's remove one of the crisscrossing branches of this rose bush. Now, let's get down. Here's a cane that's very small. It's even smaller than a pencil. So we want to go somewhere between 4 and 6 inches. And like on all pruning, we prune to an outside bud. So we'll select a bud on the back side of this cane, and there's one right there. So I'll prune just above that, forcing that new growth out that way. On this one, this is also pencil size and smaller, so we'll come up somewhere between 4 and 6 inches, and here's a bud right here. So we'll make the pruning cut at that point. Now on these canes, these are a little bit larger. They're not quite forefinger size, but let's say they are. Let's go a little bit higher up on the cane. And you'll notice that there's a good outside bud right there. So we'll make our pruning cut just above that point. And you'll notice the new growth is just beginning to swell. That's the time for pruning roses, just before spring starts. You don't want them into full leaf, so you want the growth just to begin. Here's also another good outside bud, so we'll prune that just a little bit higher. Now is what we've accomplished is we've opened up the plant, we've allowed for better air circulation, we've also allowed for good sun exposure into the center of the plant, and by pruning above the outside buds, we're opening and forcing that growth outward. And we're going to get long flower stems and large flowers on this bush. Keep in mind during the summer season that there are some plants in the garden that will not need any kind of pruning at all. This one, for example, when it reaches the height that you want, simply go in and cut out the top. It's not quite high enough for me right now, so I'm not going to cut out the top. But once I did cut the top out, then it would encourage the bottom growth here to bush out, and it would make a much bushier plant. But again, don't do it unless it needs it. Now, I did notice one thing. There is some dead growth in here, so let's go in with a small pruners and cut it out. Whoops, there we go. And remove that completely whenever it appears in any type of a juniper or cypress. Get rid of it. Now, over here we have a hydrangea, and most of the pruning of the hydrangea is done during the winter, except what if you want to cut a few of these and use them for winter arrangements? The best time to do it is when they're in full bloom, like this one is, and what I'll do is go in with a pair of hand shears and cut it about halfway back to the ground. See, leaving that much of a stalk so that it'll make a nice cut flower. Now, this is hung upside down and allowed to dry in a cool, well-ventilated place. We pick it when it's in full bloom like it is now to do this. This then will dry, and you can use it in your winter arrangements. The actual pruning, however, of the entire plant will wait until the winter dormant season. Keep your plants in good shape by pruning them back when they need to be pruned, but don't prune them if they don't need it. What do you do when sucker growth develops on the base of trees like this one? This is a hawthorn, and as you can see from the trunk, here comes this growth. See what happened last year? This new growth developed, and when it was cut off, it was cut right at this distance. So new growth has once again developed from that original sucker. Is what has to happen then is you have to go in right from the point at which that originates and get all of that out. There, so it's right flush. That way then that growth can't come back again. Now, why do we remove these in the first place? Not only do they look unsightly, but you know, they also are robbing strength from the parent plant here, and we want that growth instead to go into usable growth, and we want the tree to look good both. So all of those have to come right off, right at the point where they originate, just like that. Now I'll quickly clean up all of this growth so you can see it all. See how much better that looks? And in fact, I would even be tempted to go in with a knife and remove those even closer, and then maybe treat them with a little tree healing compound so that they look better and so that we have no chance of the new growth coming. Now let's also take a look at the spring flowering plants, and probably the best example is a forsythia. The spring flowering plants like the forsythia or forsythia, and it may be pronounced either way, should be pruned immediately after they've finished flowering. So that's usually, you know, in May or June or whatever part of the world you live in, right after they finish flowering, because the growth that develops is the growth that will produce the following season's blossoms. It's recommended that 1/3 of the old growth be taken out of a forsythia. So let's go in here and I'll prune out just a couple of these old growths. This allows for better air circulation and sunlight exposure too, as we do this. Some of these branches are a little bit difficult to pull out after you cut them back. Okay, we're getting some of them out, thinning it out a little bit. You'll also notice, let me pull this back so you can see back here in the back, there's some of these sucker growths that are growing really tall. Now, we also want to remove them, and the main reason why we want to remove them, or at least cut them partially back, is that otherwise they ruin the shape of the plant. Now, see, by removing those and cutting them down, we keep the plant within bounds. They also will branch out and become a very useful part of this forsythia. And it will flower then much more prolifically next year because you have just that many more branches developing. We'll also take a look at some of the other plants, especially the evergreens, that can use pruning during the summer season. What do you do with some of the other broad-leafed evergreens in the garden? This one, for example, has all new red foliage growth on it, and by pruning it back, we encourage the new red growth to develop, and you don't really need a pair of pruning shears for that. So all I'll do is to reach in and pick out that center growth. That's what we call pinching the plant back. And by doing that, then we encourage it to side branch. And by side branching, then we'll get maybe in place of one growth, we'll get up to 6 or 7 growths, or maybe only 2 or 3. But it does vary considerably, but we get a much bushier plant. So when the new red growth develops on this, it'll be just massive. And it will also cause the plant to bush out more. As you'll notice here, this plant is pretty leggy and not too attractive. Also, let's take a look. Here we have a growth that started way down here. It just keeps going up all by itself. So let's reach in here with the pruning shears in this case and actually pinch that growth out. So once again, we encourage these side buds to develop and it becomes a much bushier plant. That's really what we want to do. By pruning plants like this, and again, let me remind you that you should not prune them unless they need pruning. But by pruning them, we can make them much bushier, more attractive landscape plants. Like the forsythia, the lilac blossom should be removed shortly after it finishes flowering, but be careful how you remove it, because if you cut back too far, you're cutting off next year's flowers. The important thing is to cut just below and remove only the last year's flowers. Don't in any way damage by pruning back too far and eliminating the blossoms for the following year. Now this not only accomplishes in pruning a certain amount of the plant, but it also makes the tree look a heck of a lot better, as you can see. And this is a job that takes a little bit of time, and a lot of people kind of neglect it, and that's all right too. If you don't want to prune back your lilacs, go ahead and leave them. The only problem is you do cut down on the next year's blossoms. So for the few minutes that it does take to prune back a lilac, it's sure well worth the time to go ahead and do it. You can see already in this very small area in which I've worked how much better the plant looks by simply removing the lilacs. Now what about hedges? They do need pruning too, but there are certain times of the year you should prune them. So let's take a look at how to do it and when to do it. Hedges are really neat for providing privacy and screening and kind of a property divider as well. But there are a few things you should know about them. First of all, there are several different ways you can prune a hedge. You can use the hand shears, or you can use an electric shear, which is really handy. Be sure you're careful with it so you don't cut the cord or that you don't come back on your leg when you do go down with the motion. So be especially careful. The other thing that you should know is that these types of hedges should not be pruned late in the summer if you live in a cold area, because pruning stimulates growth. Then if you do it just before a cold spell, on comes that new growth, we get cold weather, and the new growth will freeze back, maybe even do damage to the entire hedge. So do watch when you prune. Late spring, early summer, and midsummer are the best times to prune hedges. After midsummer, avoid pruning at all. And that's how you prune hedges. And that's what all of pruning is about. It's simple, good, common sense. Always prune whenever a branch needs to be pruned, just above an outside bud so you force the growth outward. Always prune so that you eliminate any crisscrossing branches, any weak branches, any dead branches, or any decayed branches. Basically, that's all you have to know. The allowing of good air circulation and sunlight exposure is the key to pruning. So if you use those good common sense practices, you'll be able to prune anything in the garden.